The blood on Victoria Wright's hands wouldn't wash away, no matter how hard she scrubbed them raw in the creek water just outside Hill City, South Dakota. And though it had been 3 years since that terrible night in Chicago, she could still see the crimson staining her palms every time she closed her eyes. She had come west to disappear, to become someone else, to leave behind the woman who had accidentally killed a man in self-defense and fled before the corrupt police could hang her for a crime that wasn't murder at all. The year was 1876, and Hill City was still rough around the edges. A mining town that had sprung up after gold was discovered in the Black Hills just 2 years prior, and Victoria had found work as a seamstress in a small shop on Main Street, keeping her head down and her past buried deep. She was 23 years old and felt ancient, weathered by guilt and fear in ways that had nothing to do with the sun-beaten landscape surrounding her new home. Every stranger's glance made her pulse race. Every unfamiliar voice calling out on the street made her wonder if someone had finally tracked her down. She lived in a tiny room above the seamstress shop, venturing out only for necessities, speaking to as few people as possible, and building walls around herself that grew higher with each passing day. That was until Jackson Vale rode into town on a dusty afternoon in late September, his horse lathered and tired, his own face showing the kind of exhaustion that came from days on the trail. He was a cattle driver, 26 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of strong coffee. He dismounted outside the general store, and Victoria happened to be walking past, her arms full of fabric she was delivering to a customer 3 doors down. She wouldn't have noticed him at all except that his horse, a beautiful paint mare, suddenly spooked at a dog that came tearing around the corner, and the animal reared, nearly trampling Victoria where she stood. Jackson moved faster than she would have thought possible, grabbing the mare's bridle with one hand and pulling Victoria back with the other, the fabric spilling from her arms onto the dusty street. They stood there for a moment, his hand still gripping her elbow, her heart hammering against her ribs, and when their eyes met she saw something there that made her want to run in the opposite direction as fast as her legs could carry her. It was kindness, genuine and unguarded, and she had spent so long avoiding exactly that kind of connection. "You all right, madam?" he asked, his voice low and concerned, still holding her steady even though the immediate danger had passed. "I'm fine," she said quickly, pulling away from his touch and bending to gather the scattered fabric. "Thank you." He crouched down to help her, picking up the yards of blue calico and dark wool, dusting them off carefully before handing them back to her. "I'm real sorry about that. Belle doesn't usually spook so easy, but we've been on the trail for near 2 weeks and she's jumpy." "It's fine," Victoria repeated, avoiding his eyes now, taking the fabric from him and holding it against her chest like a shield. "No harm done." "Let me at least buy you a cup of coffee," Jackson offered, standing and gesturing toward the restaurant across the street. "It's the least I can do after nearly getting you trampled." "That's not necessary," she said, already backing away, ready to flee to the safety of her solitude. "Maybe not necessary, but I'd like to," he said, and there was something earnest in the way he looked at her that made her pause despite herself. "I just got into town and don't know a soul here. Would be nice to have a friendly face to talk to." She should have said no. Every instinct she had cultivated over the past 3 years screamed at her to refuse, to walk away, to maintain the careful distance she kept between herself and everyone else. But there was something about the way he stood there, dusty and tired and genuinely hopeful, that made the word yes slip out before she could stop it. They sat in the restaurant, a small establishment that served decent food to the miners and ranch hands who populated Hill City. And Jackson ordered coffee for both of them along with a plate of biscuits that he insisted on sharing. Victoria sat stiffly across from him, her hands folded in her lap, still ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. "I'm Jackson Vale," he said, wrapping his hands around the warm coffee cup. "Most folks call me Jack. I've been driving cattle up from Texas, but I'm thinking about settling somewhere around here. Heard there's good ranching land to be had if you know where to look." "Victoria," she said quietly, not offering her last name, not offering any additional information. "That's a pretty name," he said, and it wasn't a line or flattery, just a simple observation delivered with that same earnest quality that made her uncomfortable. "Have you been in Hill City long?" "A while," she said vaguely, taking a sip of her coffee and fixing her eyes on the table between them. Jackson seemed to sense her reluctance to talk about herself and shifted the conversation to safer topics, telling her about the trail drive, about the country he had passed through, about the changing landscape as they moved north. He had an easy way of talking, filling the silence without demanding anything from her, and despite herself, Victoria found her shoulders relaxing slightly, the tight knot of anxiety in her chest loosening just a fraction. "What do you do here?" he asked eventually, gesturing to the fabric she had set on the chair beside her. "I'm a seamstress," she said. "I work for Mrs. Patterson's shop on Main Street." "That's good work," he said, nodding. "Important work. Everybody needs clothes, especially in a place like this where things wear out fast." They sat there for another 20 minutes, Jackson doing most of the talking while Victoria offered brief responses. And when they finally stood to leave, he thanked her for the company with such genuine warmth that she felt something twist in her chest, something that felt dangerously like longing. "Could I see you again?" he asked as they stood on the street, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dusty road. "Maybe take you to dinner tomorrow evening." "I don't think that's a good idea," she said quickly, clutching the fabric tighter against her chest. "Why not?" he asked, not pushy but curious, his head tilted slightly as he studied her face. "I'll just disappoint you," she said, the words coming out before she could think better of them, raw and honest in a way that surprised her. Jackson was quiet for a moment and then he smiled, slow and genuine. "Let me be the judge of that." She stared at him, caught off guard by the simple confidence in his voice, by the way he looked at her as though he saw something worth seeing, and before she could talk herself out of it, she found herself nodding. "Tomorrow evening then, 6 o'clock. "I'll meet you here," he said, still smiling, and then he tipped his hat and led his mare toward the livery stable, leaving Victoria standing on the street wondering what on earth she had just agreed to. That night, lying in her narrow bed above the seamstress shop, Victoria stared at the ceiling and told herself she would cancel, that she would leave him a message saying she couldn't come, that it was foolish to let anyone get close when her entire life was built on lies and running. But when 6 o'clock came the following evening, she found herself putting on her best dress, a simple green cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and walking to the restaurant with her heart in her throat. Jackson was already waiting, cleaned up from the trail dust, his dark hair still damp from washing, wearing clothes that were simple but well kept. His face lit up when he saw her, and he stood immediately, pulling out her chair before she could object. "I'm glad you came," he said as they settled at the table. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," she admitted, surprising herself again with honesty. "What changed your mind?" he asked, genuinely curious. She considered lying, considered deflecting, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made deception feel impossible. "I'm not entirely sure," she said finally. Maybe I'm just tired of eating alone." They ordered dinner, simple fare of beef stew and fresh bread. And this time Victoria found herself contributing more to the conversation, asking questions about his life, learning that he had grown up on a small ranch in Texas, that his parents had both died of fever when he was 19, that he had spent the past 7 years working cattle drives to save enough money to start his own spread. He talked about his dreams with an enthusiasm that was almost childlike, describing the kind of ranch he wanted to build, the horses he wanted to raise, the life he wanted to create. "What about you?" he asked eventually, leaning back in his chair with his coffee cup cradled in both hands. "What brought you to Hill City?" The question she had been dreading, the one she had known would come eventually. She felt her body tense, her guard slamming back into place. "Just needed a fresh start," she said carefully, keeping her voice neutral. "Nothing wrong with that," Jackson said easily. "Plenty of folks out here looking for the same thing." She waited for him to push, to ask more questions, to dig into the past she was so desperate to hide, but he didn't. He simply accepted her answer and moved on, talking about the ranch land he had been scouting, about a property about 10 miles outside of town that seemed promising. His respect for her privacy disarmed her more than any amount of questioning would have. Over the next few weeks, Jackson became a regular presence in Victoria's carefully controlled life. He would stop by the seamstress shop in the afternoons, always with some excuse, needing a shirt mended or buttons replaced, staying to chat with her while she worked. He took her to dinner twice more, and then to a town dance that she reluctantly attended, surprised to find herself actually enjoying the music and the movement. Jackson's hand warm and steady on her waist as they moved across the floor. She kept waiting for the walls to close in, for the fear to overwhelm her, for some sign that she needed to run again. But instead she found herself slowly, tentatively, beginning to relax. Jackson never pressed her for information about her past, never demanded more than she was willing to give, content to simply be with her in the present. He made her laugh with stories from his cattle driving days, brought her wildflowers he picked on his rides around the countryside, and treated her with a respect and gentleness that she hadn't experienced in years. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure, and Victoria found herself caught between the desire to protect herself and the growing need to let someone in, to trust again, to believe that she might deserve something good after all the darkness she had carried for so long. One evening in late October, as they sat on a bench outside the restaurant watching the sun set over the Black Hills, Jackson took her hand in his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that was both tender and tentative. "Victoria," he said quietly, his voice serious in a way she hadn't heard before. "I know you've got things in your past you don't want to talk about, and that's all right. We've all got our ghosts, but I need you to know something." Her heart was racing, fear and hope tangled so tightly she couldn't tell them apart. "What?" "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply, his eyes meeting hers with that same directness that had caught her attention the first day they met. "And I don't need to know everything about where you've been to know that I want to be where you're going." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath, making her eyes burn with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in 3 years. "Jackson, you don't have to say anything right now," he interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to know, wanted you to understand that whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone anymore, not if you don't want to." She couldn't speak, couldn't find words adequate to express the tangle of emotions churning through her. So instead she leaned against him, letting her head rest on his shoulder, feeling his arm come around her to hold her steady, and for the first time since that terrible night in Chicago, she felt something that might have been hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of autumn colors and growing intimacy. Jackson purchased the ranch land he had been scouting, a beautiful spread with good water and shelter, and spent his days starting to build a house, hiring local workers to help with the heavy construction while he focused on the details. He talked about his plans with such enthusiasm, painting pictures of the future with his words, and Victoria found herself drawn into his vision despite her best efforts to maintain emotional distance. She helped him pick out curtains and furniture when he made trips into town, offering her seamstress's eye for color and quality. And slowly she realized that he was building this house with her in mind, creating spaces that reflected conversations they had had, incorporating details she had mentioned in passing. It should have frightened her, the way he was weaving her into his future so completely, but instead it filled her with a warmth that was almost painful in its intensity. It was in early November, with winter starting to creep into the Black Hills, that everything changed. Victoria was in the seamstress shop, working on a wedding dress for a local rancher's daughter, when the door opened and a man walked in that made her blood run cold. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face hard and angular, his eyes scanning the shop with the calculated precision of someone used to finding what he was looking for. She recognized him immediately even though she had never seen him before, recognized the type if not the individual, and she knew with sick certainty that her past had finally caught up with her. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Patterson asked from behind the counter, her voice friendly and professional. "I'm looking for a woman," the man said, his voice flat and businesslike. About 23 years old, dark hair, green eyes. She would have come to Hill City about 3 years ago, probably using a different name. "I'm a private detective hired by the family of Marcus Thornton from Chicago. He was killed 3 years ago, and the woman responsible fled before she could be brought to justice." Victoria's hands had stopped moving, the needle frozen halfway through the silk fabric, her entire body rigid with terror. "Mrs. Patterson was frowning, clearly thinking, and Victoria knew she had seconds at most before the older woman's eyes turned to her, before recognition dawned, before everything she had built here crumbled to dust. "I can't say I know anyone matching that description, Mrs. Patterson said slowly, and Victoria could hear the lie in her voice, could hear the doubt creeping in. "But if I hear anything, I'll be sure to let you know." "Where are you staying?" "The hotel on Main Street," the man said. "Name's Richard Cross. I'd appreciate any information you can provide. There's a substantial reward for anyone who can help locate this woman." He left, and Victoria and Mrs. Patterson stared at each other across the shop, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, Mrs. Patterson spoke, her voice carefully neutral. "Victoria, is there something you need to tell me?" "I didn't murder anyone," Victoria said, her voice shaking, the needle finally falling from her nerveless fingers. "He attacked me. I was defending myself, but his family has money and connections, and I knew I would never get a fair trial. So I ran." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, studying Victoria's face, and then she sighed heavily. "I believe you, child. I've known you for 3 years, and I know the kind of person you are. But that man isn't going to stop looking, and if he's offering a reward, someone in this town will talk eventually." "I know," Victoria whispered, already mentally cataloging what she would need to pack, how quickly she could disappear. "I'll leave tonight." "And go where, Mrs. Patterson asked gently. "You can't run forever, Victoria. Eventually you have to stop and face what's chasing you." "I can't," Victoria said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "They'll hang me. They won't care what really happened. They won't care that I was defending myself." "What about Jackson?" Mrs. Patterson asked quietly. Are you just going to leave without saying goodbye? The thought of never seeing Jackson again felt like a knife to the chest. But the alternative, letting him get tangled up in her mess, potentially putting him in danger, was unbearable. "It's better this way," she said, wiping roughly at her tears. "He deserves someone without all this baggage." "That boy is in love with you," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "Don't you think he deserves to know the truth? Don't you think he deserves a chance to help?" "I can't drag him into this," Victoria said, shaking her head. "I won't." But Mrs. Patterson was already moving toward the door, already calling out to a young boy passing by on the street, pressing a coin into his hand, and giving him instructions to fetch Jackson Vale from his ranch as quickly as possible. Victoria wanted to protest, wanted to stop her, but the older woman fixed her with a look that brooked no argument. "You sit down and finish that dress," Mrs. Patterson said. "And when Jackson gets here, you tell him the truth. Let him make his own choices about what he wants to do with that information." Jackson arrived less than an hour later, riding hard, his face creased with worry. Mrs. Patterson led him into the shop, and then discreetly disappeared into the back room, leaving Victoria and Jackson alone in the main space, surrounded by bolts of fabric and the wedding dress that now seemed like a cruel mockery of everything she would never have. "What's wrong?" Jackson asked immediately, crossing the room to take her hands in his. Mrs. Patterson's message said it was urgent. Victoria took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his eyes, knowing that this might be the last time he looked at her with anything other than disgust or disappointment. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And after I do, you're probably going to want nothing to do with me." "That's not true," Jackson said firmly, but she pulled her hands away, needing the distance to get through this. "Just listen," she said, "please." And then she told him everything. About Chicago, about working as a clerk in a shop owned by her aunt, about Marcus Thornton, a wealthy man twice her age who had taken an unwanted interest in her. She told him about the night Thornton had followed her home, about how he had forced his way into her room, about the struggle that ensued. She told him about the fire poker she had grabbed in desperation, about the single blow to his head that had sent him falling, about the horrible stillness of his body on the floor and the blood that pooled beneath him. "I didn't mean to kill him," she said, the words tumbling out now that she had started, 3 years of guilt and fear spilling forth. "I just wanted him to stop. I wanted him to leave me alone, but he was dead and I knew no one would believe me. His family had power, had connections to the police. I would have been arrested and hanged and no one would have cared that I was just trying to protect myself. So I ran. I've been running ever since." When she finally fell silent, tears streaming down her face, Jackson was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Is that detective still in town?" "He's staying at the hotel," Victoria said, wiping at her face with shaking hands. "Someone will tell him about me eventually. The reward he's offering is too good for people to ignore. I need to leave tonight before he finds me." "No," Jackson said firmly, and Victoria's head snapped up, staring at him in confusion. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean you're not running anymore," Jackson said, his jaw set in a way she had never seen before, determination radiating from every line of his body. "We're going to figure this out together." "Jackson, you don't understand," she said desperately. "If they find me, they'll take me back to Chicago, they'll hang me." "Not if we can prove you were acting in self-defense," he said. "Not if we can show what really happened." "How?" she asked, feeling the hopelessness crushing down on her. "It's been 3 years. There are no witnesses. It's just my word against the reputation of a dead man from a powerful family." Jackson was quiet for a moment, thinking, and then his expression changed, something like hope flickering in his eyes. Did anyone else know that Thornton was bothering you? Anyone you told about his unwanted attention? Victoria thought back, trying to remember through the haze of fear and trauma. My aunt, she said slowly. I told her he made me uncomfortable, that he was always finding excuses to come into the shop when I was working alone. And there was another clerk, a girl named Sarah, who witnessed him cornering me once. She told him to leave me alone. That's something, Jackson said. That establishes a pattern of behavior. And what about the scene where it happened? Was there any evidence that you struggled, that he had forced his way into your room? The door was broken, Victoria said, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. He had kicked it in, and there were bruises on my arms where he had grabbed me, scratches on his face where I had tried to fight him off. Did anyone document that? Take photographs, write a report? The police came, Victoria said, but I didn't wait to see what they would do. I left that night before they could arrest me. Jackson took her hands again, holding them firmly when she tried to pull away. Listen to me, Victoria. You were defending yourself. That's not murder, that's survival, and I'm not going to let them punish you for surviving. What are you going to do? She asked, afraid to hope. First, I'm going to talk to that detective, Jackson said. I'm going to explain the situation and see if he's willing to listen to reason. If Thornton's family truly wants justice, then they should be willing to hear the full story. And if he's not willing to listen, Victoria asked, Jackson's expression hardened. Then we'll find another way. But I promise you, Victoria, I am not going to let them take you. Not now, not ever. The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that he could protect her, was almost enough to make her believe him. Almost. But she had spent 3 years learning that belief was dangerous, that hope could destroy you, and she couldn't quite let herself trust that this might actually work out. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. I lied to you. I kept this from you. You should be angry. I'm not angry, Jackson said, his voice softening. I'm heartbroken that you've been carrying this alone for so long. I'm furious that someone hurt you and made you feel like you couldn't defend yourself. But I'm not angry at you, Victoria. I could never be angry at you for surviving. The words broke something open inside her, and she found herself crying in earnest now, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Jackson pulled her against his chest, holding her while she fell apart, his hand stroking her hair, his voice murmuring reassurances that she couldn't quite hear over the sound of her own grief and relief. When she finally quieted, exhausted and wrung out, Jackson pulled back just enough to look at her face. I meant what I said before, he told her. I'm in love with you, and that doesn't change because you've got a past. It doesn't change because you made hard choices to survive. If anything, it makes me love you more, because I see how strong you are, how brave you've been. I don't feel brave, Victoria whispered. The bravest people never do, Jackson said, and then he kissed her gentle and sweet, a promise wrapped in tenderness. That evening, Jackson went to the hotel to speak with Richard Cross while Victoria waited at the seamstress shop, Mrs. Patterson sitting with her, holding her hand and offering silent support. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness, every sound from the street making Victoria jump, expecting at any moment to hear the detective's voice demanding her arrest. When Jackson finally returned, his expression was grim. He's not interested in listening, he said without preamble. He said his job is to bring you back to Chicago, not to investigate the circumstances of Thornton's death. The family has already determined you're guilty and he's just there to collect you. Victoria felt her last shred of hope crumble. Then I have to run, she said. Tonight. There might be another option, Jackson said slowly, clearly working through an idea. It's not ideal, but it could buy us time. What? Victoria asked, willing to consider anything at this point. We get married, Jackson said. Tonight, right now. Under territorial law, a husband has certain rights to protect his wife from extradition, especially if there's a question about the validity of the charges. It won't stop them permanently, but it will slow them down, give us time to build a real defense. Victoria stared at him. Jackson, you can't marry me just to keep me from being arrested. That's not fair to you. I'm not marrying you just to keep you from being arrested, Jackson said, taking her hands again. I'm marrying you because I love you and I was going to ask you anyway. I've been carrying my mother's ring around for 2 weeks trying to find the perfect moment. This isn't how I wanted to propose, but the sentiment is the same. Victoria Wright, will you marry me? She looked at him. This man who had ridden into her life less than 2 months ago and turned everything upside down, who looked at her with such genuine love and conviction that it made her chest ache. She thought about all the reasons she should say no, all the ways this could go wrong, all the danger she was bringing into his life. And then she thought about the alternative, about running again, about spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder and never letting anyone close. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening from across the room, immediately sprang into action. The minister lives just down the street, she said. I'll fetch him. Jackson, you go get witnesses. We'll need at least 2, and Victoria, come with me. If you're getting married, you're wearing something better than that work dress. Everything happened in a blur after that. Mrs. Patterson pulled out a dress she had been working on for another customer, a beautiful cream-colored silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, and helped Victoria change into it. Jackson returned with 2 ranch hands who worked his property, both men looking confused but willing to help. The minister arrived, an elderly man named Reverend Martin, who asked no questions when Mrs. Patterson explained they needed a marriage performed immediately. They stood in the seamstress shop, surrounded by fabric and thread and the tools of Victoria's trade, and spoke their vows in voices that shook with emotion and urgency. Jackson slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, a simple gold band with a small sapphire that caught the lamplight, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed her with a tenderness that made her forget, just for a moment, all the fear and uncertainty swirling around them. "You're safe now," he murmured against her lips. "I've got you." But safety was an illusion, as Victoria learned the next morning when Richard Cross showed up at Jackson's hotel room where they had spent their wedding night. The detective was accompanied by the local sheriff, a man named Tom Brennan who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the situation. "Mrs. Vale," Cross said, his voice cold and professional. "Or should I say Mrs. Wright? I'm here to take you back to Chicago to face charges for the murder of Marcus Thornton." "She's not going anywhere," Jackson said, stepping between Victoria and the detective. "My wife is under my protection, and under territorial law, you can't extradite her without proving the validity of your charges in a local court." Cross's expression didn't change. "I have a warrant for her arrest signed by a judge in Chicago." "A Chicago judge has no jurisdiction here," Jackson said firmly. "If you want to take my wife, you'll have to go through the territorial court system, which means presenting your case to a judge here and proving you have grounds for extradition." Sheriff Brennan cleared his throat. "He's right, Cross. I can't just hand her over based on a warrant from another jurisdiction. You'll need to file the proper paperwork with Judge Harrison and make your case." Cross looked like he wanted to argue, but he clearly knew the law well enough to realize he was beaten, at least temporarily. "Fine," he said coldly. "But don't think this is over. I'll have my paperwork filed by this afternoon, and Judge Harrison will hear the case tomorrow morning. And when he grants my extradition order, nothing you can do will stop me from taking her back to Chicago." After they left, Victoria sank onto the bed, her legs no longer able to support her. "We bought one day," she said hollowly. "What good is one day? One day is enough to send telegrams," Jackson said, already pulling on his coat. "I'm going to wire your aunt in Chicago, and that clerk you mentioned, Sarah. I'm going to explain the situation and ask them if they're willing to provide testimony about Thornton's behavior, about what they witnessed. If they are, I'm going to ask them to send affidavits by telegraph, sworn statements that we can present to the judge." "My aunt won't help," Victoria said bitterly. "When Thornton died, his family's lawyer came to question her. She told me later that she had said she knew nothing about any harassment, that she didn't want trouble with such a powerful family. She chose protecting her business over protecting me." Jackson's expression darkened. "Then I'll make it clear that her business will be in far more trouble if she doesn't tell the truth now. And the clerk, Sarah, she might be more willing to help, especially if she knows you're facing hanging for defending yourself." He left, and Victoria spent the day in an agony of waiting, Mrs. Patterson arriving at noon with fresh clothes and food that Victoria couldn't eat. The older woman sat with her, talking about nothing and everything, clearly trying to distract her from the sword hanging over her head. Jackson returned in the late afternoon, his expression cautiously optimistic. "Sarah responded," he said. "She remembers what happened, and she's willing to provide a statement. She said she always felt guilty for not speaking up when Thornton died, that she knew he had been harassing you but was too afraid of losing her job to say anything. She's sending a full affidavit detailing everything she witnessed, and it should arrive by telegraph in the next few hours." "And my aunt?" Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. "Nothing yet," Jackson admitted, "but Sarah's statement is strong. She witnessed Thornton cornering you, heard him making inappropriate comments, saw the way he would wait for you to be alone. It establishes a pattern of predatory behavior that supports your claim of self-defense." "Will it be enough?" Victoria asked. "I don't know," Jackson said honestly. "But it's more than we had this morning." The hearing the next day was held in the small courthouse that served Hill City and the surrounding territory. Judge Harrison was a weathered man in his 60s who had a reputation for fairness and a low tolerance for nonsense. Richard Cross presented his case first, laying out the facts of Marcus Thornton's death and Victoria's flight from Chicago, painting her as a dangerous murderer who had escaped justice. When it was Jackson's turn, he stood and addressed the judge with a clarity and conviction that made Victoria's heart swell with love and gratitude. He explained the circumstances of Thornton's harassment, presented Sarah's affidavit detailing her observations of Thornton's behavior, and argued that Victoria had acted in self-defense when Thornton had broken into her room and attacked her. "Your Honor," Jackson said, his voice ringing through the courtroom, "my wife is not a murderer. She's a survivor. She defended herself against a man who had been stalking and harassing her for months, a man who broke into her room with the clear intent to assault her. If the circumstances were reversed, if she were a man who had killed a woman attacking him, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. We would call it justified, and we would be right to do so." Judge Harrison studied the affidavit for a long moment, then looked at Victoria. "Mrs. Vale, do you have anything to say on your own behalf?" Victoria stood on shaking legs, Jackson's hand squeezing hers once before releasing it. "Your Honor, I know running made me look guilty, but I was terrified. Marcus Thornton came from a wealthy, powerful family with connections to the police. I was just a clerk with no resources, no one to speak for me. I knew if I stayed, I would be arrested and convicted regardless of the truth. So yes, I ran, but I'm not running anymore. I'm ready to tell the truth about what happened and face whatever consequences come from that, as long as those consequences are based on the truth and not on the lies and power of the Thornton family." The judge was quiet for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Cross, I'm denying your extradition request." Victoria felt her knees nearly buckle with relief, but the judge wasn't finished. "However," Judge Harrison continued, "this matter is not closed. Mrs. Vale, you stand accused of a serious crime, and while the evidence presented here today suggests there may be mitigating circumstances, I cannot simply dismiss the charges without a proper investigation. I'm ordering that you remain in Hill City under your husband's supervision, while I write to the authorities in Chicago and request a full review of the case, including examination of any physical evidence that may have been collected at the scene." "Your Honor, the Thornton family will never agree to a fair investigation," Cross protested. "Then it's fortunate that I'm not asking for the Thornton family's permission," Judge Harrison said dryly. "I'm ordering it as an officer of the territorial court. If the Chicago authorities refuse to cooperate, that refusal will factor heavily into my final decision on this matter. This hearing is adjourned." Victoria and Jackson left the courthouse in a daze, not quite victory but not defeat either. They walked back to Jackson's hotel room in silence, and only when they were safely inside with the door closed did Victoria finally let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. "He believed me," she said wonderingly. "The judge actually believed me." "Of course he did," Jackson said, pulling her into his arms, "because you were telling the truth." "This isn't over," Victoria said, even as she leaned into his embrace. "Cross isn't going to give up, and the Thornton family will fight this." "Let them fight," Jackson said. "We'll fight back. And we'll win, Victoria. I promise you, we'll win." They spent the next few weeks in a strange limbo, waiting for word from Chicago while trying to build some semblance of a normal life. Victoria continued working at the seamstress shop, though Mrs. Patterson insisted on paying her more now and giving her more responsibility. Jackson worked on his ranch, and Victoria would ride out to visit him in the afternoons, watching as his dreams slowly took shape in wood and stone and sweat. They talked about the future in careful, hopeful terms, about the life they would build together once this shadow had finally passed. Jackson wanted children, at least 3 or 4, and Victoria found herself imagining what it would be like to raise a family with this man, to create something good and lasting after so much darkness. It was in early December, with snow beginning to dust the Black Hills, that the telegram finally arrived. Judge Harrison summoned them to the courthouse, and Victoria went with her heart in her throat, convinced that this was when everything would finally fall apart. But when the judge read the contents of the telegram, his expression was one of satisfaction rather than regret. "The Chicago Police Department has completed their review of the evidence from Marcus Thornton's death," he said. "The photographs taken at the scene clearly show the broken door and signs of struggle consistent with your account, Mrs. Vale. Additionally, the medical examiner's report notes defensive wounds on Thornton's body and the position of his injury consistent with a single blow from someone facing him, not an attack from behind or a premeditated assault. Most significantly, they uncovered evidence that Thornton had been accused of similar behavior toward other young women in the past, accusations that his family had suppressed through their influence and money." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but she couldn't find words to speak. "Based on this evidence," Judge Harrison continued, "the Chicago authorities have declined to pursue murder charges against you. The case is officially closed, and you are free from any legal jeopardy related to Marcus Thornton's death." This time, when Victoria's legs gave out, Jackson was there to catch her, holding her up as she sobbed with relief and joy, and the release of 3 years of fear and guilt. The judge dismissed them with a kind smile, and they walked out of the courthouse into the snowy afternoon as truly free people. "It's over," Victoria whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "It's really over." "It's over," Jackson confirmed, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You're safe, Victoria. Finally, you're safe." Richard Cross left town the next day, his case closed and his purpose concluded, and Victoria watched him ride away with a feeling of profound relief. She would never forget what she had been through, would never stop carrying the weight of having taken a life even in self-defense. But at least now she could begin to heal without constantly looking over her shoulder. Christmas came, and Victoria and Jackson celebrated quietly in the small house on his ranch that was finally finished enough to be livable. They hung evergreen branches and cooked a simple but delicious meal, and afterward, sitting by the fire with Jackson's arms around her, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. "I love you," she told him, turning to look at his face in the firelight. "I don't think I've said that yet, not properly, but I love you, Jackson. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "You saved yourself," Jackson said gently. "I just helped a little. And I love you too, Victoria, more than I ever thought I could love anyone." They made love that night in their new home, slow and tender and full of promise, and Victoria felt the last of her walls finally crumble, leaving her open and vulnerable and wholly his. The months that followed were the happiest of Victoria's life. She continued working at the seamstress shop, but spent more and more time at the ranch, learning the rhythms of that life, helping Jackson build his herd and establish his reputation as a fair and hard-working rancher. The community of Hill City slowly embraced her fully, no longer seeing her as the mysterious seamstress who kept to herself, but as Mrs. Vale, Jackson's wife, a woman who had survived something terrible and come out stronger for it. In the spring of 1877, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She told Jackson on a warm April evening, and he lifted her off her feet and spun her around with such joy that she laughed until her sides hurt. "A baby," he kept saying wonderingly. "We're going to have a baby." Their son was born in December of that year, right as snow began to fall in earnest. They named him Daniel, and he had Jackson's dark hair and Victoria's green eyes, and a temperament that was equal parts stubborn and sweet. Victoria had never known it was possible to love someone so fiercely, so completely, and watching Jackson with their son, the gentleness and pride in every gesture, made her fall in love with her husband all over again. 2 years later, their daughter arrived, a red-faced, squalling girl they named Sarah after the clerk who had provided the testimony that helped save Victoria. Sarah had her father's easy nature and her mother's determination, and from the moment she could walk, she was following her brother everywhere, determined not to be left behind. The ranch prospered, Jackson's hard work and good judgment paying off in steady growth and increasing respect from neighboring ranchers. Victoria eventually opened her own seamstress shop in town, a larger space where she employed 3 other women, and took on the more complicated commissions that Mrs. Patterson's shop couldn't handle. They were building a life, solid and real, rooted in the soil of the Black Hills and nurtured by their love for each other. It was in the summer of 1881, with Daniel now 3 years old and Sarah 18 months, that Victoria received a letter that she had never expected. It was from her aunt in Chicago, written in a shaky hand that suggested illness or old age. Victoria read it slowly, Jackson sitting beside her on the porch of their ranch house, the children playing in the yard under the watchful eye of Maria, a young woman they had hired to help with the house and the children. The letter was an apology, rambling and guilty, explaining that her aunt had been afraid, that she had made the wrong choice in not supporting Victoria when Thornton died, that she had regretted it every day since. She wrote that she was dying, that the doctor had given her only a few months to live, and that she wanted to see Victoria one more time to ask forgiveness before she passed. Victoria set the letter down, her emotions tangled. Part of her was still angry at her aunt's betrayal, at the way she had chosen her own safety over Victoria's life. But another part of her, the part that had learned about forgiveness and second chances through Jackson's love, understood that people made mistakes when they were afraid, that fear could make cowards of even good people. "What do you want to do?" Jackson asked quietly. "I want to see her," Victoria said after a long moment. "I want to let her apologize and I want to forgive her, not because what she did was okay, but because I don't want to carry that anger anymore. I've carried enough anger and fear for a lifetime." Jackson nodded. "Then we'll go to Chicago. All of us. We'll make it a family trip." They traveled to Chicago in early September, taking the train from Rapid City, the children wide-eyed and excited by the journey. Victoria's aunt lived in the same apartment above her shop where Victoria had once worked, though the shop itself had changed hands, sold to someone else when her aunt became too ill to manage it. The reunion was emotional and difficult and ultimately healing. Victoria's aunt wept and apologized, her thin hands clutching Victoria's with desperate strength, and Victoria found that forgiveness came easier than she had expected. They spent 3 days in Chicago, Victoria showing Jackson the city where she had grown up, pointing out landmarks from her past with the detachment of someone viewing a life that no longer quite belonged to her. On their last evening, they visited Marcus Thornton's grave. Victoria stood before the simple headstone, Jackson's hand warm in hers, and spoke words she had been holding inside for 5 years. "I'm sorry you died," she said quietly. "I'm sorry that you made the choices you did, that you became the kind of man who would attack a frightened young woman. I'm sorry that your family never had to face what you really were, but I'm not sorry I survived. I'm not sorry I defended myself, and I'm not going to carry guilt for that anymore." They left Chicago the next day, traveling back across the country to their home in the Black Hills, and Victoria felt as though she had finally closed the last chapter of her old life, finally put to rest all the ghosts that had haunted her. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and small joys. In 1883, their third child arrived, another boy they named Thomas, who had his mother's dark hair and his father's solid build. The ranch continued to grow, Jackson's reputation as a rancher spreading beyond Hill City to the surrounding territories. Victoria's seamstress business thrived, and she began training young women in the trade, giving them skills and independence just as Mrs. Patterson had once given her. In 1885, when Daniel was 8 and Sarah 6 and Thomas 2, they decided to build a larger house, something that could accommodate their growing family and the life they had created. Jackson designed it himself, working with a carpenter from Hill City, and the result was a beautiful 2-story structure with a wide porch and windows that let in light from every direction. Victoria planted a garden around the house, vegetables and flowers mixed together in a riot of color and growth, and on summer evenings, she would sit on the porch with Jackson, watching their children play in the yard, and feel such profound gratitude that it sometimes brought tears to her eyes. "What are you thinking about?" Jackson would ask on those evenings, his arm around her shoulders, both of them rocking slowly in the chairs he had built, "How lucky I am," Victoria would answer. "How close I came to missing all of this." "You were never going to miss this," Jackson would say with the same conviction he had shown that first day when he promised to protect her. "We were always going to find each other, I'm sure of it." And Victoria, who had learned to believe in happy endings and second chances and the transformative power of love, found that she believed him. In the winter of 1887, Victoria's aunt passed away in her sleep, and Victoria received a letter from the lawyer handling her estate informing her that she had been left everything: the sale of the shop, her aunt's savings, all of it. It wasn't a fortune, but it was substantial, and Victoria and Jackson decided to use it to establish a fund for women in Hill City who needed help, whether that was money to start a business or support to leave a dangerous situation or resources to pursue an education. They called it the Sarah Fund, after both their daughter and the clerk who had stood up for Victoria when it mattered most, and it became one of Victoria's greatest prides, watching the women of Hill City use those resources to build better lives for themselves. The children grew and thrived. Daniel became a serious, studious boy who loved books and learning, eventually going to school in Rapid City with plans to become a lawyer. Sarah grew into a strong-willed, adventurous girl who could ride as well as any cowboy, and had no patience for anyone who suggested she should be more ladylike. Thomas was quiet and observant, with a gift for understanding animals that made him a natural rancher, already talking at age 6 about running the ranch when he grew up. In 1890, when Victoria was 37 and Jackson 40, they welcomed their fourth and final child, a daughter they named Hope, because that was what she represented, the continuing promise of their future together. Hope was a happy baby, content and easy, and she completed their family in a way that felt perfect and right. As the century drew to a close, as the wild frontier began to settle into something more civilized and structured, Victoria would sometimes think back to that afternoon in September of 1876, when a dusty cowboy had nearly trampled her on Main Street, when she had been so certain that she was beyond saving, beyond loving, beyond any kind of happy ending. She had told him she would just disappoint him, and he had said to let him be the judge of that. And he had judged her worthy, had looked past the fear and the secrets and the guilt to see the woman underneath, and he had loved her anyway, fiercely and completely and without reservation. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in November of 1896, surrounded by their children and friends, the ranch house full of laughter and music and love. That night, after everyone had gone home or gone to bed, Victoria and Jackson stood on their porch looking out at the land they had built their life on, the Black Hills rising dark and majestic against the starlit sky. "I've been thinking," Jackson said, his arm around her waist, holding her close against the November chill. "About what?" Victoria asked, leaning into his warmth. "About that day we met," he said. "About how you tried to warn me off, told me you would just disappoint me." Victoria laughed softly. "I was so sure I was right." "I'm glad you were wrong," Jackson said, turning her to face him, his hands framing her face with the same tenderness he had shown her from the very beginning. "You could never disappoint me, Victoria, not in 20 years, not in 100. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, and I thank God every day that my horse spooked at just the right moment to bring us together." "I love you," Victoria said, the words as true and deep as they had been the first time she spoke them. "I love you so much it still scares me sometimes." "Don't be scared," Jackson said, kissing her softly. "We've got this. We've always had this." And standing there in the moonlight with 2 decades of love and struggle and triumph behind them and a future full of promise ahead, Victoria finally, completely believed him. The years continued their steady march. Daniel finished his education and opened a law practice in Rapid City, becoming known as a fierce advocate for the underrepresented, his mother's story having shaped his passion for justice. Sarah married a rancher from a neighboring property, a good man who respected her strength and never tried to contain her spirit, and they had 3 children who were as wild and wonderful as their mother. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations as Jackson grew older, proving himself to be a wise and capable manager who had his father's gift for reading cattle and land. Hope, the youngest, became a teacher, opening a school for children in the rural areas around Hill City, riding circuit on horseback to reach students who otherwise would have had no access to education. Victoria and Jackson grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing, but their love remaining as strong and constant as it had been from the beginning. They watched their grandchildren arrive and grow, watched Hill City transform from a rough mining town into an established community, watched the wild frontier of their youth become the settled west of a new century. On a warm evening in June of 1914, Jackson passed away peacefully in his sleep, Victoria beside him holding his hand. He was 63 years old and had lived a life full of purpose and love, and Victoria, though heartbroken, took comfort in knowing that they had made every moment count. She continued to live on the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still working in her garden, still running her seamstress business though now from home, still contributing to the Sarah Fund that had helped so many women over the years. She told stories about their grandfather to the younger children, about the man who had loved without hesitation, who had believed in second chances, who had seen the best in everyone he met. Victoria lived another 12 years, passing away in her sleep on a spring morning in 1926, just a few months after her 73rd birthday. She was buried beside Jackson on a hill overlooking their ranch, their headstones simple and close together, and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to remember a love story that had begun with a near accident and a cup of coffee and a cowboy's simple belief that people deserved to be judged by who they were, not where they had been. The ranch continued through the generations, Thomas's children and then his grandchildren working the land that Jackson and Victoria had built their dreams on. The Sarah Fund grew and expanded, eventually becoming a foundation that supported women throughout South Dakota and beyond. Daniel's law practice became a family business, his own children carrying on his commitment to justice. Sarah's descendants became legendary ranchers in their own right, known for their skill and their fierce independence. Hope's school system expanded, eventually influencing education policy throughout the state. And always, in every generation, the story was told of Victoria and Jackson, of the woman who thought she had nothing to offer, and the man who taught her that love didn't require perfection, only honesty and courage. It became a family legend, a touchstone, a reminder that the worst moments of our lives don't have to define us, that redemption is always possible, and that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a simple choice to trust, to hope, and to believe that we are worth more than our mistakes. The house they built still stands, now over a century old, maintained by the family trust that oversees the ranch. The garden Victoria planted has been tended by generations of her descendants, the flowers she chose still blooming every spring in riot of color. The town of Hill City remembers them too, with a historical marker on Main Street near where the seamstress shop once stood, telling the story of Victoria Wright Vale and Jackson Vale, pioneers who helped build not just a town but a legacy of compassion and second chances. In the end, That afternoon when Jackson said, "Let me be the judge of that," changed not just 2 lives but hundreds, the ripples of their love spreading out across time and distance, touching people who would never know their names but would benefit from the foundation they had built. Victoria had been certain she would disappoint him, but instead she had given him a lifetime of love, a family that would last for generations, and a story that would inspire long after both of them were gone. That was the real truth that Jackson had seen from the beginning, the truth that Victoria had learned slowly over years of being loved and cherished. We are all worthy of redemption. We are all deserving of second chances. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let someone see us as we truly are and trust them to love us anyway. Their story became more than just a romance, more than just a tale of the Old West. It became a testament to the power of belief, the strength of forgiveness, and the transformative nature of unconditional love. And every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed across the Black Hills and the sun set gold over the ranch they had built together, their descendants would remember and be grateful for a dusty cowboy who had looked at a frightened, scarred woman and seen not disappointment but possibility, not failure but hope, not an ending but a beautiful beginning.